So welcome, I hope you've enjoyed your lunch and we are ready to start again. So, sorry we're a little bit late, but you know, it's lunch, takes time, is important. But we are one speaker short today, so I think we'll be okay. So my name is Ellie Belfiore, and I'm your chair this afternoon of this session on inequality and oppression in cultural policy, which is as important a topic as we're ever going to discuss. The way that the session is going to work is we're going to hear from our three speakers, and we will take questions on all three papers at the end, and we'll try and make it as much as possible into a conversation. So we start with Santiago Alfaro from Peru, with a paper entitled Tackling Inequalities at the Heart of Cultural Policy, Reflections and Evidence from the Rampant Disadvantages in the Peruvian Cultural Occupations. So, Santiago, when you get to 15 minutes, I'll just wave to let you know that you've got 5 minutes left. But the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
Do you have the clicker? Oh, it's here, sorry. If I manage not to drop it. There you are.
That's very useful.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
that helps, doesn't it?
I'm going to look if it is okay. I don't know.
Perfect.
That's okay? Thank you for all people involved in this organization. And thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to show some evidence about ethnic, gender, and social class inequalities in the screen industries in Peru. No? In 2022, the OECD published the Culture Fix, People, Place, and Industries. The report points out that cultural and creative industries are a significant driver of local development through job creation and income generation, and generate important spillovers to the wider economy. Since the late 19th, similar arguments about the economic impact of culture have been promoted by governments, multilateral organizations, and researchers. However, during the same period of time, a large number of studies have shown that the jobs created by the cultural and creative industries are characterized by precariousness and are largely conditioned by inequality. In this presentation, I follow these approaches to analyze the cultural occupation of the screen industries from Peru based on three axes of social inequality: class, gender, and ethnicity. The analysis will focus on television and films occupation. For this purpose, we have made, or I have made some, I have used some information from different databases, especially. I can go away. It's not working.
Oh.
It's another direction. No.
Oh.
It's not working. No.
Do we have to turn it on, maybe, or?
No, there is nothing, any button to put on.
Help.
I could continue and you could use the presentation? Yeah? Mm-hmm.
Oh!
No.
But I don't think it was us.
I could continue, I don't know. Because we don't have time. The analysis will focus, I use the information from different databases, especially from the 2017 Population and Housing Census and the National Film Audiovisual Registry. No? In addition, the literature on cultural work development in British academia has been consulted to interpret the results and make comparison between UK and Peruvian experience. Although some views describe members of the creative class as a self-statement, meritocratic, and openness, as does Richard Florida, the evidence gathered show that opportunities in cultural work in the Peruvian screen industries are inevitably distributed across social groups. The presentation has two parts. I'm going to resume the introduction and the literature review, because the most important information now is the data about the inequality. No? The creative is a central and distinctive component of the cultural and creative industries. However, it was only at the beginning of the millennium that cultural work started to come under closer academic scrutiny, as Banks says. Prior to this, the influence of the Frankfurt School and the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies led to the outcome of cultural production, the artifacts themselves, which took precedence over the social condition of their inception, as McRobbie said. The new academic interest in cultural work arose alongside the expansion of the creative industries policy and its unproblematic and inherently free conception of it. For that reason, research on cultural occupation has focused on addressing the paradox of cool, creative, and egalitarian jobs by emphasizing the structural inequalities and barriers to entering and maintaining employment in the cultural and creative industries. I identified two bodies of work stand out from the literature produced over the last 20 years. The first is what could be termed critical theory. It encompasses studies in the political economy of culture, governmental approach, feminist and cultural studies. Their approach is aimed at explaining inequalities based on the structure and organization of capitalism. No? There are another body of work that is that put the attention in other issues. No, I call this as glass ceiling theories. It is characterized by using social science tools to identify invisible barriers and biases that restrict access and opportunities in cultural work. This type of research has to develop empirical studies and to refer to Bourdieu theory and the intersectionality approach. I'm going to use both literatures in my explanation. No? I prefer to talk about the case of Peru. No? Since 1990, the Peruvian government has implemented a series of reforms to expand the market economy. As a result, after the return to democracy between 2002 and 2017, according to the World Bank, the Peruvian economy grew at the average of rate of 5%. Over the last 20 years, the cultural and creative industries have also expanded. A study of the Universidad or Pacific University identified that between 2010 and 2018, copyright-based industries increased their contribution to gross domestic products and employment by 39% and 11% respectively. Following the lead of the British Academy question is, what type of employment has grown? No? To answer the question, I will first have to identify the number of people employed in the cultural and creative industries. According to the census, there are 175,000 people working in that in this sector. Maybe there is an underrepresentation of the main number of people working in this type of occupation. And I use different database to analyze the profile of the people who working in this sector. The first axis that I'm going to show the data is from the class inequality. Inequality by social class is one of the most researches in academia. At the same time, it is this inequality that requires the greatest availability of information. No? In the UK, the best source of data on the workforce is the ONS LFC, which use the National Statistics Socioeconomic Classification. No such information is available in Peru. The RENCA has not integrated any socioeconomic variables. The census collect indicators that will allow us index of the socioeconomic level of cultural occupation, but that effort goes beyond the scope of this presentation. Moreover, the information required to do such a task will have to be requested. It is not publicly available. No? Due to the above, we have used other proxy variable, the father occupation. The result of the data process indicate that the father of people with professional or managerial position, directors, actors, tend to have fathers with master degree or bachelors. None of them, the father of people in this type of occupation, reach only secondary education. In contrast, only about 30% of the parents of people in routines and technical occupation study at the university. Therefore, in occupation where working class background people predominate, the father is more likely to have had only a secondary school education. As it happened with the broadcasting and audiovisual recording technician. The father of 39% only complete secondary school. No? The census recorded very few people in managerial positions. For this reason, the level of confidence is low, but in any case, the data also show a trend. People from the privileged class dominate the occupation with the highest status and income in the screen industries. No? I'm going to look the following variable, the gender inequality, because how much time I have? 10 minutes? Yeah. No. There are 173 natural persons registered in the RENCA. It's official registration from the Ministry of Culture. 35% are women and 65% are men. In terms of the volume of people involved in films and audiovisual activity, there is a large majority of men. The proportion has remained stable since the creation of the Ministry of Culture, although the percentage of women registered in the RENCA has slightly increased between 2018 and 2021 by 4%, a period in which public funding for films and audiovisual activity was increased. No? Men are therefore overrepresented in the workforce of Peru screen industries. The same is true at the level of the most privileged occupation. Of the total number of people dedicated to directing, acting, camera, casting, art direction, only 23% are women. These figures contrast with other occupations of lesser responsibility, such as production assistants, where 64% are women. In production, very important activity in the screen industries. There is an apparent equality, 51% women and 49 men, as in the case with acting. However, in order to make a correct interpretation, it must be borne in mind that the information comes from the statements of the professionals, not from their actual performance in the professional exercise. No? The figures available on this exacerbate the gaps. There is research made by Fabiola Reina from Peru, and she found that between 2001 and 2021, 624 Peruvian films were realized. On the total, 88% were directed by men, only 9% by women, no? And 3% were co-directed. No? We do not have statistical evidence of effective gender division in cultural occupation in filmmaking, but a qualitative study suggests that the feminization of production may be greater than indicates by the statistics. Another research conducted interviews with well-known female producers in the audiovisual sector, and their testimonies indicate that their occupation is dominated by women to such an extent that in the film projects, the work duo of director and producer is often considered a marriage. No? The higher incidence of women in this type of work is due, according to the interviewees, to gender stereotypes that link them to tasks related to care and organization. The same stereotypes will explain the feminization of other occupations such as art direction, script, makeup, and wardrobe. No? The direction of films is an occupation dominated by men, and the productions, no, where you have to care people, is dominated by women. No? And finally, the ethnic inequalities. Statistics indicate that the inequalities exist between ethnic groups in access and opportunities to participate in the cultural and creative industries. According to the 2017 census, only 5% of people employed in cultural and creative industries speak an indigenous language, while speakers of indigenous language account for 60% of the national population. The same is true for those who identify themselves as members of indigenous and Afro-Peruvian people. In cultural occupation, they account for 20% of the total, while at the national level, they make 29%. A Quechua speaker, then, is less likely to work in film or music than a Spanish speaker. At the same time, although not to the extent of one might think, people of indigenous origin are less represented on the screen or on the radio than the white and mestizo population. No? The ethnic inequalities grow further when looking at the 7 cultural occupations in the Peruvian screen industry. The results from the census show an overrepresentation of self-identified white people in all occupations, due to in all cases their share in higher than the share achieved by white people, no, 5%, in relation to the total population. The share of the self-identified white population quadruples in professional or managerial occupation, directors of cultural and entertainment centers, films, theater, and other activities as actors and advertising. Compared to operational occupations such as broadcasting and audiovisual recording technician or radio and television technician, no? Where you can find more people from indigenous origins. No? finally, no, the discussion, no. Despite its limits, the information analyzed on cultural occupation offer clues that the screen industries do not represent the sociodemographic diversity of Peruvian society, as is the case in the United Kingdom. The cultural labor market is not open and meritocratic, contrary that what is indicated by governments, multilateral organizations, and some researchers who promote the benefits of the creative economy. No? Access and opportunities to work as a film director or actor are not equitably distributed for reasons of social class, gender, and ethnicity. The indicators collected show that men from the privileged class and white or mestizos are overrepresented in the film and television workforce, and particularly in the most prestigious positions. No? Correcting this type of public problems need an wide approach, because inequality is a multidimensional public problem that also requires multidimensional interpretation and solution. For example, the requirement of people through quotas for minoritized social groups is necessary, but at the same time insufficient. Inequality is also reproduced in the structure and organization of markets, in the formation of cultural capital during early childhood, through differentiate access to higher education, or through the absence of social policies to support maternity. Linking cultural products with the material condition of production and cultural consumption is the route to address the different roots of inequality. But the problem is in general, the cultural policies don't see and don't work in the reduction of inequality. The predominance in many countries of the democratization of culture policies aim to at promoting access to a cultural offer centered on activity has contributed to reproducing these inequalities by not contemplating the condition of cultural production and consumption, or worrying about the impact of the cultural and social inequality. Two different types of problems for cultural following Dave O'Brien. No? As well as policies to promote the creative economy do not usually prioritize inequality. For their part, policies based on the binomial cultural and development or cultural democracy have offered greater programmatical elements to address the inequalities. However, its principles are often not put in practice, or are only used to address part of the existing inequality. No? We need to have a systematic approach to inequality in cultural occupation. The rise of, and that is important to include the variable of the participation. The rights of the population are not restricted to cultural creation. They also encompass the right to take part in the decision of cultural policy. In the British academia, don't discuss the participation of artists in the design and implement of the cultural policies. No? The fact is that the self-employed workers do not have option to express their opinion and influence the decision making are also a factor of inequality. The inclusion of the political dimension of inequality in studies on cultural work will make the analysis more comprehensive and will allow the production of information that will contribute to developing cultural policies capable of reducing the multiple expression of inequality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Santiago. I'm sure we'll come to talk a lot more about some of the data that we presented. But now we have our second speaker, Guy Galupo-Borba, from the Universidade de São Paulo, Brazil. And he's going to talk to us about cultural policy and cultural democracy at the junction of the right of the city.
Could I have
Of course. Oh, sorry, this speaker is not here. Can we have the next, please?
Oh, Guilherme Galupo-Borba. Hi, everyone. Hello.
So the one after.
This is me. All right.
Oh,
this
yeah,
one.
that is you.
All right, so to start off with, I'd like to thank the whole team that put this event together. I know there's a lot of work behind the scenes, and I'm incredibly excited to be here. I really have not had a lot of time to put the presentation together, as much as the team had time or didn't, or make it through the conference. So it's basically to help me out. You know, I don't have anything very exciting here on the screen, but it's to help me out and you guys in my presentation. So before I start, I think it's important to say a little bit where I come from. So I'm a geographer. That was my first major. And then I did a master's and PhD in relating urbanism, urban studies with culture. So my master's was on the urban landscape of the periphery of metropolis. Then my PhD was about how the cultural dimension also influenced urban transformations in downtown São Paulo. And I have worked as a public policy analyst at the Secretariat of Culture of the City Government of São Paulo. And now I'm acting as director of the historical archives of the City Government of São Paulo. So this presentation actually is something I did like 2 years ago, and then I kind of updated for today. So, and obviously because I'm a geographer, I tried to merge cultural policy, cultural democracy, and urban studies. And in this case, I got the social movement called the Right to the City. I don't know how many of you, raise your hands please if anybody has ever heard of this movement called the Right to the City. Okay, good to know. All right, so it's pretty, I mean, the Right to the City has had a lot of influence in some urban policies in Brazil, but I'm gonna get to that. So let's go to my first slide. Oops, not working. Oh, not working. To be working. I'm trying all the clicks. Hello everyone. El técnico no está allá. Fue al baño.
He's gone, yeah.
Ah, no. I need my slides. Over here. See. That's what I'm trying. I'm trying to point that out, but it's not working. Maybe change the batteries. No, not working. I do have it in PPT. I can quickly make it a PDF. I don't know. Huh? Ah, okay. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Okay. So, okay, let's try to go very quickly then now. So my main questions for this paper were, in what way do contemporary cultural practices, and in this case, trying to get the Right to the City on board of these cultural practices, both in civil society and public power, constitute a vehicle for the propagation of citizen participation and emancipation overall? Who are the actors at play, and in this case, the state, civil society, NGOs, private sector, and whatnot? How do they work to achieve the cultural democracy through cultural policy? And how could cultural policies be part of a wider urban project for social renewal and cohesion? Or how does the right to the city resonate with cultural democracy? These are kind of profound and very difficult to tackle questions. I'm not going to be able to tackle them as much as I wish I could, but I will try my best, okay? Or at least I have tried. So, pathways to social transformation. So I guess the first thing is to give some sort of background on a little bit of Latin American society and oligarchies in terms of a lot of inequality in power, in politics, in social cohesion, in access to resources and whatnot. So we have a lot of inequalities. And the importance of the state to bring some sort of social welfare. So in terms of in the 80s and the 90s, when you started having new constitutions in Brazil, for example, in 1989, where the state starts to reformulate itself, but still having a very authoritarian culture, a very authoritarian culture of politics. And the neoliberal turn, now we all suffer that somehow here in Latin America in very different ways from the global south and the global north, also kind of inherited this idea of cultural practices from the market or cultural practices from the state, but from like democratization of culture as opposed to cultural democracy. So the state also absorbed that concept of culture and the necessity for culture to be part of like a market-oriented approach, but also a top-bottom approach, right? Which is not what cultural democracy is about. So the main idea in the 80s and the 90s was mainly as culture by the state as a top-down. And then you have Marilena Chauí, who is a very important philosopher in Brazil. She gave some approaches or some ideas of what culture is viewed in general in Brazil, but I could say they can resonate in other Latin American cities. And the first one was the liberal idea, which identifies culture as fine arts, as a privilege of an educated elite, which has to do with democratization of culture. The second idea of culture was the authoritarian, which presents the state as an official producer and a censor of culture, which is pretty much in place still, but I think we're getting better at this point. The populist, which denominates popular culture with crafts and folklore, with popular version of the fine arts and the cultural industry. And last, and the neoliberal, which identifies culture and mass event in mass media, narcissism tending into private public institutions in the hands of entrepreneurs. So we all know that there's a wide array of concepts of culture and also how the state itself, from the national, from the state and municipal level, sometimes they range from all these four ideas of culture. But I would like to focus on cultural democracy, bottom-up, subunit, local, municipal practices of culture. So just to give a fair perspective of what is understood by democratization of culture, by Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, we all know him, I guess, is to expand the distribution of cultural goods among the population, increase access to cultural institutions from a vertical, centralizing, and elitist aspect. Whereas cultural democracy, defined by Botelho, recognizes diversity and everyday culture, bring the state and society and other actors together, cultivation of local culture's own needs, more related to the everyday lives of people, which resonates with the emancipation that is part of the right to the city movement. And now we're going to get there, okay? The neoliberal turn in Latin America put a lot of emphasis on a lot of financialization of the economy, international markets, commodification of urban space, and in this case, the urban space is a very, very important commodity. So especially the real estate sector of the economy, and in São Paulo this is very, very important, will obviously look at any piece of urban space as a profitable commodity, right? And then whenever the culture is taken in a specific urban space, it has to either go through a market-oriented approach, or it will be dead completely, right? Or it won't have any urban space to happen. And the right to the city brings us the idea that we have the right to the city, of course, but the rights to change ourselves. I don't know how many of you know David Harvey. He's a very, very important Marxist and geographer, and has studied a lot about the impacts of capitalism in big cities around the world. So the right to the city movement basically helps us understand how we have the right to this urban space, because the urban phenomenon, or the urban dimension, helps us understand, because we have a lot of people where most inequality is, a lot of homelessness, a lot of movements that also take place. So rebellion or any kind of social upheaval happens in large urban areas. So I guess if you're trying to understand how cultural democracy can take place importantly, we also have to understand the urban dimension as well, because we have a lot of movements for living conditions, for working conditions, for gender inequality, ethical issues. It's all encompassed in the right to the city, but focusing on the relation to the space, relation to the city space, because this fight between the market and the state and the population is really entangled in how much culture can take place in the city. So one part of this idea of the social movement right of the city is the freedom of everyday life and the emancipation. I know it's a very broad term, but for Lefebvre, Henri Lefebvre, the French guy who came up with this concept in the 1960s in Paris, for him, the freedom of speech and freedom of participation in the public realm was very, very important. So I will be focusing on public policies and cultural democracy taking place in the public realm, taking place with citizen participation and movements that are for everybody to see and participate. And obviously the right to the city helps understand, prevent, and counteract the exclusionary dynamics of global cities, as I had already said. How much time do I have left? My God. Okay, thanks. So still on a little bit of how the right to the city can help us fight global trends. I think it's very important to understand that you have, I don't know if I look here, if I look there, I'm gonna look here, okay. You have different aspects of this globalization, which is a big, broad term. I don't wanna reduce that, but we have global collective imagery and spaces of consultation and participation. What I mean by that is that even though you still have a lot of places of exclusion produced by capitalism and global movements, you also have a lot of democratization of access to technology, access to internet, access to smartphones, access to social media, and these have helped the youth specifically organize themselves and start producing events. And now I'm talking a little bit more about the reality in São Paulo, but I'm pretty sure it also expands in other places, where the youth has also taken advantage of all these global technologies and accessibilities for organization and for promoting of events and cultural activities in general. But the state has become a little bit offshore of this, of what's going on with the youth in São Paulo, but has also tried to help, and then I'm going to be talk about some examples in São Paulo and Brazil about these examples of trying to understand how the youth can also promote events and cultural activities. Okay, so the examples I brought are from Brazil specifically. Remember, merging cultural democracy, bottom-up approaches, specifically the youth, but also how the state started not having an authoritarian view, but taking an approach from what was happening, or what people were constructing already. Okay? So in Brazil, there was a major political shift in 2002 from the Workers' Party until 2015. Culture as a basic right and strengthening democracy. That was a major shift that happened in terms of cultural policy in Brazil, and that's when cultural democracy really started to happen. Was the implementation of the national culture system with greater institutionalism for the cultural sector, shared actions among governmental spheres and civil society. And there was the program, that was the first one, that is a big one here also in Latin America with Ibercultura Viva, or Pontos de Cultura, which started off in Brazil, came from this program called, in English, a live culture program, with creations of these points of cultures with the idea of not of understanding what was being created already in the local level, what was being said in the local level, merging sustainability, merging creative economy, merging parties and social events, but at the same time also giving work opportunities for the youth. And then these changes in the national level, they trickle down to the state level and to the municipal level, until you have in 2001, also with the Workers' Party in São Paulo, a major program that it's still today, in English would be Valorization of Cultural Initiatives Program, Programa para a Valorização de Iniciativas Culturais, which supports low-income young individuals or groups in the periphery of the city, with the main focus of the creation of cultural goods and cultural production and consumption, access, training, participation of small producers and creators in the culture sector. And again, the major focus was the youth. And the youth brings a lot of other dimensions in question, such as work, family, sexuality, class, ethnicity, and place of residence. The global culture, as I said, so they bring a lot of values that are not from the local culture, but are really global values coming from this access to technology, internet, and other movements around the world. But they seek greater participation and engagement in the public spaces. So the youth are the ones that are really bringing forward, 5 minutes, thanks, really bringing forward the changes that are bottom up. And with this VIBE program, the state was able to give the resources, not only technical resources, but also financial resources, structure, people, personnel, to help out this youth, which has no relation to the market intrinsically. So they can have a very important political stance, meaning they can have freedom of speech in their culture produce. So even though it's being financed by the state, that's not market driven. And it's always, these program encourages all these projects take place in the public realm again. So this program helped a lot of initiatives, a lot of cultural initiatives to take place in the periphery of the city, take place in the public space, with freedom of speech, and obviously these young people, they were trying to come up with political agendas such as gender equality, LGBTQ, places of residence, work opportunities, inequalities from the center and periphery, and there's some sort of independence and autonomy in the youth by this program. As I said, these programs also helped social contestation through the arts, so obviously connecting the right of the city to these programs. Underexploit music, for example, just as funk. So at the beginning, the market was not interested in this kind of music at all. And in São Paulo, it grew mainly because of the program, and little by little, the market obviously took over, but still it was something that really began with the program. And they have a strong capillarity in the city because all of these programs, initiatives can take place anywhere in the city, but mainly in the periphery, which tends to lack incentive from the government or sometimes from the market as well. This is just a quick map. Take a look. This is from 2020. You can probably see, but these colors on the left, the circles on the left, are we call it linguagem, languages, but I guess in English would be styles, like art styles, ranging from the arts, from visual, hip-hop, music, theater, and whatnot. And on the right are the keys for the macro regions of São Paulo. Remember that São Paulo has 11 million people living there, so it's a lot of people. And as a conclusion, I know I was whiffing through so little time. The focus is on public space, as I said, the expression of individual and collective freedoms, cultural democracy, political culture of interinstitutional coordination and cooperation. And I guess this last one is very important because in terms of public policy, it's not only the state, not only the population, but it's a variety of actors that have to come together for cultural democracy to really take place. And the youth, with the latent power of creation, participation, political engagement in public spaces, and the emancipation of autonomy of society as a whole. I said too fast, I'm really sorry, but I'm really open to questions about it, the whole thing that I tried to put together. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Perfect timing there, Guy.
I was rushing through,
very
oh my God.
impressive. So we remain in Brazil with our last speaker, who's Juliana Lopes da Silva from the Federal Institute of Brasilia in Brazil. And her presentation is entitled Affirmative Action in Brazilian Cultural Policy, a focus on public funding calls for black film production. So, the floor is yours.
So good afternoon. Thank you very much to be here in this space. I'm Juliana Lopes, and it's a pleasure to be here to discuss my short paper, actually. And this paper is based on my postdoctoral research at the Institute for Creative and Cultural Entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths, University of London, under the supervision of Dr. Cecilia Dinard, who is here with us today. Thank you very much, Cecilia. And despite the formal end of the research, the study is still ongoing. So I will start. Let's see. Yeah. Okay, it's okay. Okay, the second slide. Okay, thank you. So I will start with an overview of the presentation. I will introduce the changes in Brazil's federal cultural policy under the Workers' Party administration between 2003 and 2016. On the other hand, I will show that despite these developments, race and gender inequality in film production remained a critical challenge in Brazil cultural policy. Next, I will provide an overview and present my research questions and methodology. And finally, I will share the preliminary findings and final considerations. All images in my presentation are from Brazilian films supported by the federal affirmative funding initiatives. So I want to mention the cultural policies created during Lula da Silva's first presidential administration. Over this period, significant changes occurred in Brazil's federal cultural policy carried out by the Ministry of Culture, and I will highlight some of them. So first, culture was affirmed as a social right of Brazilian society. This means that the state has a pivotal role in promoting access to culture to the entire society. Second, a broader concept of culture was adopted by the Brazilian government. Therefore, policies were oriented towards symbolic, social, and economic values, instead of understanding culture only as fine arts. Furthermore, public cultural policies were informed by premises of cultural diversity. Also, social participation was central to developing the policies with civil society participation. An example of that was the implementation of participatory institutions such as the National Public Conference of Culture and the National Culture Council. Therefore, under these concepts, the government recognized and supported several underrepresented groups through programs and fundings to expand access to culture as producers and consumers. These groups included people from popular groups, indigenous communities, Afro-Brazilian communities, sexual and gender diversity groups, as well as cultural organizations in urban peripheries. An example of this is the Points of Culture program. It's considered by many as a successful bottom-up cultural policy model, and it has been adopted by several other countries in Latin America. However, despite these initiatives, the film sector in the country has been dealing with gender and race inequality in film productions. A study by the National Film Agency focused on analyzing the 142 Brazilian feature films commercially released in movie theaters in the year 2016. Each film had the following functions analyzed: direction, screenplay, executive production, cast, and others. This graph shows the data on film direction by gender and race. It shows a huge imbalance. What we can see is white men take the lead with 75% among directors. White women follow at 20%. Black men hold only 2%. Finally, note that there are no black women as directors. However, we need to keep in mind that Brazil is a country of more than 260 million people, where 56% of the population self-declares as black or brown, mixed race, as 51% are women. Therefore, the development of representations and narratives in Brazilian cinema does not reflect the racial and gender diversity of the population. So in the last decade, new initiatives have emerged in the Brazilian federal cultural policy to address these issues and expand the participation of black people in film and audiovisual production. In 2012, the Audiovisual Secretariat of the Ministry of Culture launched the first funding with affirmative action for race to support the film production of black filmmakers in the country. After that, new public funding initiatives with racial and gender affirmative action were launched by the two federal institutions that promote the audiovisual sector in the country: the Audiovisual Secretariat and the National Film Agency. So my analysis is based on the concepts of cultural policy and affirmative action. More specifically, I use Conclini's concept of cultural policy, which is defined as the set of interventions undertaken by the states, civil institutions, and community groups, which are organized to guide symbolic development, satisfy the cultural needs of the population, and obtain consensus for a type of order or social transformation. As for the concept of affirmative action, I use the definition of Ferre Jr. It defines affirmative action as any program, public or private, that aims to confer resources or special rights to members of a disadvantaged social group through the distribution of resources, opportunities, and cultural and historical recognition. So here are my two research questions. The first research question: why did the Brazilian federal cultural policy incorporate racial-based affirmative action in public funding calls to support black film production in the last decade, between 2012 and 2022? And the second research question: how was race-based affirmative action applied to the federal public funding for film production to support newcomer black filmmakers? So the methodology to answer these questions, I employed a combination of research methodologies. First, a literature review and readings, special new articles on affirmative action policies and their intersection with the black Brazilian cinema. Second, documental research, legislations, legal frameworks, reports, and official documents by the Brazilian government and the Ministry of Culture. And third, a qualitative analysis of a sample of federal affirmative public funding calls to evaluate how racial criteria have been adopted. So the preliminary findings, I would like to highlight the role played by the black cultural movements, social participation and activism. Regarding why the race criteria was incorporated in public fundings in the federal cultural policy, we can see the social participation and activism, and identified two different movements from civil society aiming to include racial affirmative action into federal public funding for culture in the last decade. First, in official participatory institutions, such as the National Conference of Culture and the National Culture Council. And here I would like to highlight the role played by the Afro-Brazilian groups in demanding this agenda. Another movement was the activism of Black artists and producer collectives pressuring Brazil's Ministry of Culture to recognize the existence of institutional racism and the need to develop affirmative funding for Black artists. This action resulted in the launch of a sample of the affirmative funding calls by the Ministry of Culture for different artistic areas, such as theater, dance, visual arts, including the first one addressed to young Black filmmakers. The second preliminary finding to answer the question why, what we can see is the growth of Black Brazilian cinema over the last decade in the country. And it's another factor that has contributed to the construction of the affirmative action agenda, was the increase in the number of short and feature films directed by young Black filmmakers and the promotion of festivals, exhibitions, and meetings of Black Brazilian cinema. The emergence of this new generation of screenwriters, directors, and producers is related to education and cultural public policies that aim to expand the access of young Black people to cinema and audiovisual courses at public universities, and also in free courses in neighborhoods of urban centers promoted by points of culture and grassroots cultural organizations. Intersection with the new technological production process and the popularization of the internet. Two legal frameworks of affirmative action in Brazil made it possible to implement racial affirmative action in the federal cultural policy. And I will highlight here the Statute of Racial Equality Law, approved by the Brazilian Congress in 2010. The statute laid a foundational basis for affirmative action policies in the country and aims to guarantee rights and equal opportunities for the Black Brazilian population. And the second framework that I would like to highlight is the quotas policy in education. This is the most consolidated among the modalities of affirmative action implemented by the Brazilian government. The law, which was judged constitutional by the Supreme Court in Brazil, regulates the reservation of a minimum of 50% of vacancies for admission to universities for students from public schools, with a priority on those from disadvantaged backgrounds, low income, Black, indigenous, and disabled students. So, and to answer how these affirmative action have been implemented in the federal cultural policy, I would like to highlight that the Ministry of Culture in Brazil has two institutions working with the film sector in the country. The first one, SAVI, the Audiovisual Secretariat, and the other one, Ancine, the National Film Agency. Both of the institutions manage dedicated public funds and support film productions in Brazil. SAVI SAVI has historically worked on programs and fundings focused on educational, social, and cultural values. Its main source of resources is the National Fund of Culture. Under the federal cultural policy framework that I have mentioned before in the beginning of the presentation, the Audiovisual Secretariat adopted concepts of regionalization and democratization of film production to address asymmetries in the film industry in Brazil. In this regard, new concepts were approached in the Audiovisual Secretariat agenda, such as diversity, inclusion, and cultural citizenship. The main aim was to include new filmmakers in the market, especially from underrepresented groups, and also to support an exhibition circuit based on alternative arrangements to the commercial logic. The Audiovisual Secretariat was also responsible for launching the first affirmative public funding call in 2012, which was called Short Affirmative, Protagonism of Black Youth in the Audiovisual Production. On the other hand, ANCINE, the National Film Agency, focused on regulating and funding the film industry market. ANCINE is oriented toward the market and economic values and uses the resources of the Audiovisual Sector Fund, the major fund for the sector in the country. It also manages tax deductions for companies that invest in films. Through the Audiovisual Sector Fund, the agency applied regional inducer policy to support the production of feature films, fiction and documentary, directed and produced by filmmakers from underrepresented regions of Brazil for commercial launch in cinemas. Also, 5 years ago, the National Film Agency adopted its first and only affirmative action in funding through quotas for newcomer independent directors, women, Black, and indigenous filmmakers. Dimensions of the affirmative funding. In this path, in this direction, I identified 14 racial affirmative funding calls from SAVI and only one from ANCINE. 8 out of 14 targeted film production. Electronic games, TV series, and transmedia projects also used affirmative policies. The budget of the National Fund of Culture supported short films released in festivals, exhibitions, and meetings. And the budget of the Audiovisual Sector Fund supported feature films released in commercial movie theaters in the country. Through the research, I've identified models of affirmative funding for film production encompassing the creation of short, medium, and feature films, as well as documentary, fiction, and animated films. These models include targeted creative leadership. Funding was directly allocated to Black filmmakers in leadership roles as directors and producers. This applies to both individuals and film companies. Thematic focus, funding was directed towards film narratives that align with specific themes, such as Afro-Brazilian cultural heritage and indigenous-centric stories. Regional inclusivity. An inductive scoring system was applied as a regionalization criterion to support films from underrepresented regions in Brazil. And an intersectional criteria. The inclusion of race, racial, and gender quotas was done intersectionally, considering other factors like supporting newcomer directors and regionalization efforts. To conclude the presentation, I would like to highlight that the inclusion of affirmative actions in the federal affirmative funding was a significant step to promote fair and more democratic access to public resources, and also to expand the representation and opportunities of Black filmmakers in the cinematographic sector. Also, I would like to highlight that Black artistic and cultural movements were crucial in pushing for affirmative action in federal funding in Brazil. However, the models of affirmative funding proved to be ad hoc initiatives with low institutionalization, no legal frameworks for cultural policies, and a lack of budget and attention to the sector's production chain, making it subject to discontinuities and interruptions. After an interruption of these initiatives by the far-right government of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Audiovisual Secretariat under the third presidential administration of Lula da Silva was resumed affirmative funding for audiovisual production since this year, 2023. Future research and the continuity of these initiatives and on the impact of affirmative funding on the trajectories of Black filmmakers, on the productive and distributed arrangements of audiovisual works they carried out can contribute to the evaluation of these success and the limits of these recent initiatives in Brazilian federal cultural policy. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliana, for another spot-on-time presentation.
Oh,
nice.
nice.
And am I right that we've got Antonio kind of in the room? So we've got a fourth speaker. So
really
do you
nice.
want to come up and we'll try and get you your slides? Oh, magic! That's good. So I don't know where the clicker has gone. Juliana, if you can press that to us. So. Let me introduce you while you get yourself all sorted there. So our second speaker, who's now our last speaker, is Dr. Antonio Kyler from the University of Michigan in the USA with a presentation entitled Cultural Policy of the Oppressed. So, the floor is yours. Please press speak to activate the microphone, and you've got 20 minutes. And at 15, I'll wave my
Excellent. Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just arrived today, so I apologize for being a little late. But, you know, interestingly enough, I'm actually awake. So I'm very excited to share this presentation with you all. Two of my colleagues who are librarians at the University of Michigan and I collaborated on this work, and I'm excited to share it with you. So just to provide you with the overview, I'm going to talk about, and actually, this feels like the background and rationale for the study, research questions, theoretical framework, the methodology, findings, and then conclusions and discussion. So Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancements and its benefits, and everyone has the right to the protection of the moral and material interests resulting from any scientific, literary, or artistic production of which he is the author. However, across the globe, we know that this doesn't always happen, and that there are a multiplicity of inequities that constrain opportunities for people to participate in cultural engagement, correct? And so this led my colleagues and I to think of these two questions philosophically. How have cultural policies enabled, promoted, challenged, and or subverted the creative justice and cultural engagement of those historically and continuously oppressed? And then for whom are cultural policies, and whom should cultural policy studies center, and why? So then our big research questions became, to what extent have cultural policy scholars published on systemic oppression, and how frequently have cultural policy scholars published on systemic oppression? Theoretically, we view our work in conversation with Freire and Boal, particularly Freire was very important for helping us to conceptualize the idea that cultural policies should be liberatory and not instruments of assimilation and acculturation and conditioning. Boal's work we found very important because it helped us to think about the ways in which arts and culture should do more than just mirror what happens in society, but that arts and culture can be used to actually help us manifest and envision possibilities that we had not considered before. And so together, we thought that Freire and Boal provided us with a really rich theoretical undertaking and underpinning for this study. Methodologically, we conducted what we would call an emergent qualitative systematic content analysis. We looked at all of the issues up until last November, I believe it was, in Cultural Trends, the International Journal of Cultural Policy, and the Journal of Arts Management, Law and Society. So that all of the issues since the inception of these journals to figure out, what's been going on relative to oppression. And what we came up with also to help us kind of guide our search were 58 concept terms categorized under 3 concept areas: forms of oppression, social identities, and practices. And just to so while you're looking at this inventory of the terms that we came up with, I initiated the search. And then my second colleague, Jason Mbezi, came behind me to confirm that what I found was actually accurate. And then after him, our third colleague, Matt Carruthers, came behind to check both of our works to make sure what we found was accurate. So we had a triple kind of like interrelated effect going on there to ensure what we found was actually what we found. So these were the terms that we came up with. Of course, it is limited to our own subjectivities, our own understanding of what's in the literature and what isn't in the literature. But these terms we thought, not comprehensively, but pretty accurately describe the history of these terms and these practices, and so that's why we approached it this way. So we use 109 total terms used to conduct the searches. Just to give you a sense of the concept terms, we looked for sexism, and then we use search terms sexist with an asterisk and misogyny. We also looked for religious oppression, and we would have like the quotation marks, and we looked for religious discrimination. We also looked for social exclusion, selected search terms like social marginalization or social marginalization in terms of the different misspellings. And then we recorded and verified the results, downloaded results for each search term as an individual CSV file, and then we coordinated and organized results according to concept term and concept area. So, of course, our subjectivities influenced this study. So our own positionalities as, I identify as Black, same gender loving, a person with disabilities. My colleagues are white, cisgender men who are upper middle class in the US. And so all of these positionalities come into play when we're talking about qualitative research and the subjectivities in terms of conceptualizing research questions as well as methodologies. There's some technical limitations as well. We found that Taylor and Francis platform indexes and search functionalities are different depending on hyphenations and spelling variations. Which is why we conducted rigorous checks for search term relevance and individual article appearance counts, not yet performed, so we have more work that we're doing in follow-up studies. Also, editorial boards and peer reviews, right? Like, some folks are not comfortable with this topic, and so we found that sometimes peer reviewers would give comments about studies, like in the case with this study where we submitted it for a review for publication. The study we did is the study we did, right? We found that some reviewers wanted us to do another study that we did not do, right? And it's like, can you just accept the study that we actually did versus the study you wanted us to do? And that was kind of an interesting experience as well. I think someone should do a study on that. So here's what we found in terms of forms of oppression. Now, I think it's interesting that you'll see further into the slides that there's lots of cultural policy scholarship about youth and arts education, but nothing about adultism and the ways in which adults constrain children's imaginations and creative abilities based on what we believe children can do and cannot do. And just as a quick aside, I have a client that I've been working with is a youth orchestra, and so they've decided to tackle adultism. And I said, well, you do understand what that means, right? That means that you have to allow some of the children to actually be on the board of the organization. And they're like, what? We have to let them on the board? And I was like, yes, and you're missing out on all of the aspirational capital that those young people bring to being on the board. And so they're actually allowing young folks to join the board of directors of the youth orchestra. Imagine that. And then, so lookism is more of a contemporary term. And then, you know, religious oppression, we were kind of surprised that there wasn't more work about that. As you can see, racism has received a lot of attention, and yet we still have more work to do about it, right? And then in terms of the social identities, non-binary seems to be more contemporary, so there's an opportunity for research around how cultural policy enable non-binaryism. More findings on social identities. And this is where you'll see youth is one of the largest. And then we move on to practices. I also think here it's interesting to point out the differences between equity and equality. So equality is when everyone starts from the same place, right? But if there's a history of gender inequality, right, longitudinally, then that means that equity has to be the solution to treat gender inequality that has been long suffered. And that's the case, I think, depending on your cultural contexts with oppression and people who have long suffered oppression in your different cultural contexts. So, in conclusion, so what this reveals is, given what has been published, we do have more questions about why does the creative sector continue to struggle to adopt an anti-oppression position, particularly if anti-oppression is more profitable. I come from the US, which is a highly capitalistic society, and it fascinates me that capitalists would insist on discriminating against people who have the means to buy a product, right? So, for example, the buying power of people who have been oppressed in the US society is about $30 trillion, give or take, in the US. So why in the world would you exclude them from buying whatever it is you have to sell if you are truly a capitalist? So another implication is that we could develop a research agenda in cultural policy around these issues to fill those gaps. One might consider critical arts management studies, cultural engagement studies, cultural policy studies, of course, but special issues and edited volumes around some of these issues to really bring more knowledge to bear and what's missing when it comes to cultural policy. In terms of teaching, to what extent do cultural policy educators incorporate criticality in their teaching of cultural policy? Is this an approach that educators should adopt? If so, into already existing coursework or into a new course entirely, right? You know, I've been kind of grappling with this, you know, when you develop a cultural policy class and you have it in a place where it seems that the students respond to it very well, it can be very difficult to try to change it because you're like, well, I know that it works. So, you know, it would be interesting to investigate how educators of cultural policy grapple with this in their own teaching philosophies. So future research should conduct deeper textual content analyses to identify and suggested remedies to oppression in the creative sector. So that, I think, you know, would be the next step that we go, is to like see what scholars are suggesting as remedies or solutions to these particular issues. And if we can do like a meta-analysis or a systematic content analysis to find out what people are suggesting will help as solutions through cultural policy. But we also wonder to what extent does socially identifying as oppressed influences the likelihood that a scholar will pursue research on the topic, right? Like if you identify as a woman, are you more likely to study issues around gender equity or gender identity, and how cultural policy enable or constrains that? So I think one of my next projects in 2 years maybe will be an edited volume, Cultural Policy of the Oppressed, kind of following off of this paper to try to fill some of those gaps in knowledge. So thank you for the presentation, but we also use this image to show how systemic these issues are and how challenging they are to address.
Thank you, Antonio, for keeping the time brilliantly. So now we have 20 minutes for questions, and I suppose it's up to us, I suppose, whether we want to go slightly over. But let's start it. So we've got quite a lot to potentially talk about. So normally, the chair sort of warms things up, but I actually would like the floor to have as much time to ask questions. And did I dream or did I see a hand? I saw a hand. So is Mariana here? Mariana, will you be helping us with the roving mic, please? Mariana, is one of the linchpins of this conference. Thank you, Mariana. I don't know. Is he on, Mariana? I mean, I can hear you, but I don't know whether.
We can hear you.
Actually, are you doing okay? Yeah.
See? Me, who's very UK centric. I'm Sophie. I'm something called a creative. I'm a lecturer in creative leadership at the University for the Creative Arts in the UK. So I'm still figuring out what that means. But all of that was hugely informative for my teaching. So thank you. I've got questions for Santiago and Juliana, and then one for you as well, Antonio, if that's okay. I'll be quick. Your two papers about the film, underrepresentation, representation in the film industry in your respective countries really beautifully bookended each other. And I guess my question is around the conditions for affirmative action in Brazil versus doesn't seem to be possible in Peru. What are the conditions, and I was thinking particularly about the charisma of leaders as well in politics in your respective countries that enable that kind of change to take place? And just as a follow-up question, Juliana, as well, I was also wondering about, you said, a lot of the affirmative policies had been very ad hoc, and I was wondering whether there was any developments in regards of making them a bit more sustainable, I guess. That was that question. And then, Antonio, my question, I just thought it was so interesting what you were talking about there. And I had a really profound question, which I've now forgotten. So there you go. I'll come back for your question. Thank you.
Thanks for your question. In Peru, the cultural policies approach are dominated by the democratization of cultures. No? For that, I can talk about affirmative action or similar measures in Peru than Brazil. No? We implement some of that because also I am the former general director of Cultural Industries and Arts of the Ministry of Culture. And during the time that I work in the state, we implement some affirmative actions, no, for the public fundings, and it raised the participation of people from different regions, and also now is increasing the number of women in film directions, no? But we need more research about the impact about that, no? But it was a very isolated initiative. In general, the main objective of the cultural policies is to create access of culture, no? Organize activities, no? And the public services don't don't think in the impact of that policies, no? Which profile of people are benefit of the budget, of the use of budget, no? For that, I want to show the evidence that because we have a very big problem, no? And this is for Peru a very important objective, to be awareness about this problematic, no?
Yes, of course. So thank you for your question. I would say that in Brazil, what happened was a historical process, especially from the new constitutional after the dictatorship period in the country. So after the constitutional from 1988, the black movement in Brazil has historically demanding for racial policies for racial equality in the country, and especially in the Lula's first government from 23, the black movement occupied positions inside the state and inside the federal government in managing the policies and in the implementations, the institutions, participatory institutions, sorry. And this relationship between the state and the black movement in the country made possible the construction of the affirmative action. And especially the affirmative action in higher education, because it's the more consolidated affirmative action that we have in our country. And this affirmative action in higher education have been demonstrating really positive results after 1 year of that this kind of policy have been implemented in the country. So what we can see in the cultural scenario is that we have a new artists and creative people that had access to the affirmative action in higher education, and now they are working in the creative sector, in the cultural sector in Brazil. And this new generation, they are pressuring the government for affirmative policies in the cultural sector and in the art sector. And what I have found in my research is that these affirmative action in cultural policy, they were implemented by these three scenarios, I can say. The legal frameworks, the Statute of Racial Equality, and the affirmative policy for education, the social movement, so the activism and social movement from the black movement in the country, and as well as the growth of the black Brazilian cinema, because the black Brazilian cinema has as well a historical process in the country. And these three scenarios, they don't have hierarchical positions between them, but they are all how can I say? They are giving this new scenario in affirmative action in Brazil, especially in the cultural policy, but it's really recently in the country. And when I was saying about the low institutionalization and the lack of budget, it's because these kind of initiatives, they are really recently. So the first affirmative action funding was in 2012, so we have 10 years. However, we have in Brazil an unstable scenario in public cultural policies, especially because this kind of affirmative action was interrupted in the last 4 years by Jair Bolsonaro's government in the country. But on the other hand, these kind of policies has been continuing by the states in the level of the states. So São Paulo was in the city of São Paulo. They have been developing this affirmative action through SPCine, a local company in São Paulo. So,
can I just add a little bit to the answer? There's one thing about public administration in Brazil that kind of explains your answer, which is if you have a 4-year for the municipal level, for example, a 4-year mayor, and that mayor implements any kind of initiative, imagine a huge amount of affirmative, bottom-up, cultural democracy kind of initiative, but the mayor doesn't make sure that this initiative goes up into the decree or bill level of the law of the public administration. It can, I don't know how to say that in English, but you have different types of laws with different forces. It can be quickly swept off by the next mayor, so that you will lose continuity. However, if there's artistic pressure of the movement, so that it can not only implement in real life, but also make it sure that it becomes a kind of law that it's much harder for the following politician to break down, most likely that law will continue. In the Nevai program that I said, that was the case, that there were 2 types of administrations that kept up the higher type of law, which is stronger. So it's much harder for any mayor to put it down, so because it becomes a law. If they don't implement it, other judicial bodies of government, for example, will actually press charges against the mayor if they don't implement. So that explains why some policies, they just fade away out of the blue from the next administration, or some of them just keep going and going. It depends on the type of law they reach.
Yeah. And I thought I would like to add that this low institutionalization, it has been because over this year, these 10 years, the fundings were really specifically initiatives in the states. So we don't have a structured policy, because the affirmative action is only inside the funding, funding the film production, and not in the other steps of the chain of the film production. So we don't see the affirmative action in exhibition, for example. So it's what I mean when I have this lack of this lack of the structure policies of affirmative action in the country. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That's been really interesting. Do we have any further questions? Okay. Okay, so I think I saw first you, then you, and then there was a hand there. Okay, Michelle. So I think the microphone. I think so. I'm not, unless if anybody struggles to hear, please let us know.
Thank you for a very interesting table or session. And I'd like to ask Antonio, well, first of all, I have like a few projects for you to do. So starting for that. No, one could be like the comparison with the cultural studies journals. I think there the approach could be quite different in terms of oppressed. And the other thing that I can imagine could be an interesting index would be, where do the articles come from? Because that also shows, of course, these journals are written in English, promoted by the Anglo universities and community. So those are the first ones that would approach. But of course, us in the South are absolutely being pushed to write in that sort of journals and not necessarily being recognized as such. So where do these articles come from? That could be also an interesting way to look at things. Okay.
Thank you for that.
Oh, Antonio, you'll get to respond, but just a little add. The presentation from us, the editors of Cultural Trends, that will have some of that information. And part of the reason why we're here is because we are conscious that we need to diversify our voices and perspectives. So we are painfully aware of that. But, do you want to comment, or are you just happy to just be given a list of jobs apparently to do?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that feedback. I think it would certainly add to the analysis and actually show how oppression kind of shows up in these different cultural contexts based on where the articles are actually coming from. But, you know, I think editorial boards and peer reviewers are more powerful than they know. So I'm also curious about the stuff that doesn't even get published that can make a contribution to our understanding about how cultural policy can actually be an intervention to subvert oppression.
So then there was you. Oh, okay. So if you don't mind, let's just walk, just because the microphone is there. Just Michelle, you go, and then we'll.
Yes,
go back
thank
to
you. Well, I'm from Mexico City, so I was very interested in Guillermo's presentation about the right to the city, and I have a few questions. First, I would like to know, like, this is the third presidential time for Lula, so I wonder if there's something else to propose about the right to the city regarding culture. Like, of course, Cultura Viva has been very, like a program that has been very exciting for many other countries, but I wonder if there's something else, and if there are other policies related to Cultura Viva. For example, I think many cities have the problem of commercial licensing for cultural spaces. So if you are a theater but you are not able to sell beer, then it's very difficult to survive. So I wonder if by starting this program, it was related with a more like integral kind of policies or laws, and if they were coordinated in multiple levels. It happens in Mexico. I think it's very similar, the public administration, the system, but it happens in Mexico right now. For example, we have the same ruling party at state level and at national level, and they are not related at all. Like, their cultural policy is almost opposite sometimes. So it's very difficult.
And it's the same party, the same political
party.
The
same political party. So I wonder, how does that work for the Workers' Party if they had like a vision like about the right to the city and they coordinated like among different levels?
Okay, thank you so much for the question, because I think I wasn't very able to maybe bring what I wanted to have brought. I think the right to the city, at least in Brazil, was major connected to the housing movement, mainly. And especially from the formulation of the Constitution of 1989. And it kind of lost a little bit of track. And we also had the World Social Forum. There was also a big movement in Brazil that brought a lot of the right to the city, and that also kind of faded away a little bit. So I just decided to bring the concept of right to the city because it is indeed, at least what I have felt, fading away. Because it's been pulverized, as in sectors, as in housing, transportation, healthcare, and the movements have also, I think, separated a bit. So that, in terms of the right to the city, I think it's losing track, I believe, from other movements. And I don't think that's necessarily bad, because you do see the right to the city, but not with this concept. You see with a different name, with a different kind of protagonism, a different type of social group, but it would be still considered part of the right to the movement. What I do think would be a bad thing is the lack of talk about freedom of speech, freedom of being, social participation in the public realm, and emancipation of the human being, like human development as opposed to professional, career-oriented development kind of thing, you know? But in terms of the other questions related to Lula and new government, I get that would be my personal interpretation of things. And I would be, you know, obviously, I would probably know that Juliana would have a similar idea or not, I don't know. But I would say that she's correct in saying when the idea of the municipal level, it's very different from the federal level in terms of how the executive can fight the legislative in terms of implementing a certain policy. So ever since either from the very beginning, Dilma's government, which was superseded by Lula, basically, and it was the same, was Workers' Party, she found much more difficulty to implement and pass laws because of the very far right or centralism of the legislative sector. So all of the laws and her incentives, they were not passed through. And that would be kind of the explanation of the coup or the impeachment. Whereas in the municipal level, as I said, the tension between the executive and the legislative is not as difficult as it is in the national level. So that's why you see more easily some laws being passed and also reaching that, as I said, that law level, that it's really much harder for a mayor in 4 years, instead of making his or her mark, fighting so that one already in place program reaches that higher level. Because every mayor has their, they want to make a mark so that it can be reelected. And also what I see is, at least after the pandemic in the municipal level, there was a lot of pulverization of the movement, social movement from the arts in general. And I would say that because people had to find other opportunities or other occupations. Because before, this would also press the municipal level to bring a certain modality or certain initiative to that next level so that you have continuity. So in the arts movement, they know about the need for continuity. That's why whenever there is some sort of movement or fight, that's what they're fighting for, either for the implementation of a new project, but sometimes when it's successful, so that you can keep. So they're asking the mayor or the executive to keep going. However, there was a mention, I think you mentioned Gilberto Gil, right? Yes, you did, right? I guess that's my personal interpretation. Gilberto Gil has a very different background from the current Minister of Culture, right? So I would say that the representation of diversity in the Ministry of Culture today is being checked, but not necessarily the fundamental technical capacities and competencies as much as Gilberto Gil had for quite a long time to implement the same high-level cultural democracy that was implemented in the past. So I would say now the main issue is obviously it's changed economically and historically, but it would be the technical body of people that are now in the Ministry of Culture. I don't see them as much as well prepared as the previous one by Gilberto Gil. Sorry, just extended.
Fascinating. I think we've got 2 questions, and I know that it's 4 o'clock, so because people have asked, we'll just let them ask their question, and then we'll go and network, and we can continue the conversations.
Thanks. So it was really interesting to hear about the Brazilian presentations, because right now in Chile we have a government that inspired many of its policies in culture from Lula's policies, but I feel that somehow these affirmative actions in our government are not really working. So I wonder, maybe it has to do with the fact that, for example, Lula's actions happened before the pandemic and not after. I thought of that just hearing you out right now of this answer, and maybe that's a reason. But for example, just to give like a short example, in the film industry right now in Chile, for example, their development fund for projects has an affirmative action, so 50% of the projects have to be outside the metropolitan region, but most of the people that work in cinema is in the metropolitan city, right? Even though if they came from other regions before. So, and then the amount of projects that they get fund is only 4 per line. So it's really hard to be affirmative when you are funding so little. So I was wondering, what do you think that made these affirmative actions in Brazil so positive and like social accepted as well? Because I'm seeing like also a little bit of backlash in the affirmative action, and this is happening really hard in the US, for example, in the education sector, right? So I'm seeing a backlash. For example, a lot of filmmakers that work in the metropolitan sector area, they're like, well, why would I even apply, right? Because it's like, there's no place for me anymore. So that creates somehow not a good perception of the affirmative action. So, and of course I support this, but I wonder how can we make it better somehow? And so if you have any, you as well, Santiago, like what do you think is like why it was so successful in Brazil? And maybe we can have some conclusions of why it's not being so good here. Yeah. And also, like, just if you know, like, how much did the budget increase for culture was with Lula? Because I imagine, like, we could see, like, these bottom-up actions and also these very specialized, maybe not fine arts, but they do our industry, right, for cinema. So they're very different, but they both seem to work. So that's my question.
I'll go from the back. I have no idea. I'm going to go for the back, the last one, and then I will hand over to Julian at least. Okay. From the last thing you mentioned, I don't know. I really don't know about how the budget has increased. I don't know. I would say it probably did increase at least a bit in comparison to the former. But what I would say made the most important difference was the system of culture. National system. He implemented a national system. Another very, very successful case study in Brazilian policy is health policy for the SUS, because it's integrated all throughout the country. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of it, but it's because of the national system of health, so which was already in place even before Lula, if I'm not mistaken, right? SUS. So they kind of saw that policy, which was in health, as an example, because it was really integrated from national, state, municipal level. So it trickled down, bottom up all the time. So they got this system of health as an example, and they started putting system of national system of culture, national system of transportation, they started doing these systems that would have, so that that has to do with decentralization and disconcentration, which is the state had to abide by the federal law and had to create a state system. And the state, and then every municipal level, every city had to abide by the system. So in fact, I would say that one of the most important successful tools by this affirmative actions and the cultural policies as well has to do with the fact that from a decision that is top down, but at the same time there was a lot of freedom to decide how the system, the state or the municipal would be. But they would still have to implement, and there was also a lot of financial resources being given by the federal law. So there was some sort of autonomy by state and municipal. They had to come up with a system, producing conferences, so that we would spend the first or 2 years with a lot of participation from civil society to build the system. And when you have participation, we also know that it tends to continue more because people fight for it. So, and there was continuity of the Workers' Party for some time. So I would say that would explain a little bit the system, the deconcentration and decentralization of the system with some autonomy, social participation, and a period of time that enabled the state, the structure, to kind of build itself a bit better, I think.
So thank you for your question. I would say that the concept of affirmative action was in the beginning of the cultural policies in Brazil with Gilberto Gil, when the funding was democratized for the population, for these underrepresented groups in the country. However, I agree with Guilherme because I think what can be doing the affirmative action successful in the federal cultural policy is the social participation. Because we had a difficult period in Brazil with a far-right government and a pandemic as well. And over this period, the social movement fight for resources for an emergency law in the country. So we have now two fundings that came from these social movements and this participation, that is Aldir Blanc law and Paulo Gustavo law. And these two laws... Sorry? No, the two... Yeah, they are the two laws. They are federal laws, but they are in this relation with the states and the municipalities of the country. And what happened is that inside these laws, these two laws, the social movements fighted to affirmative action, to include affirmative action inside these two laws, two federal laws in the country. So I think we are in a process in the country, especially in the federal cultural policy, because now what we can see is that the government is resuming the policies that were extinguished under Bolsonaro's government, because under Bolsonaro's government, the Minister of Culture was extinguished. So what we can see now is that the Minister of Culture is resuming the policies, and they are resuming all the policies that were extinguished under the far-right government. But the concept and the idea of affirmative action, it has been supported by the social participation. So next year, on March, we will have the fourth National Public Conference in the Culture Conference in the country. And this National Public Conference Culture and the National System of Culture, as Guilherme said, they are the heart of these policies, because the social groups, the cultural groups, they are building together the public policies in the country.
Well, clearly something to keep an eye on, exciting things. Last question, and then we all go networking and keep talking over drinks. Stephen.
Thank you. Stephen Hadley from Trinity College, Dublin. I'll keep this very short. Yeah? Yes. It's in specifically a UK context, but more broadly, a lot of the initiatives around cultural democracy have been interpreted as taking resources away from the traditional cultural sector.
Okay, please repeat that.
Sorry?
Please repeat that, just to make sure that I got it right.
Yeah, and this is because we're talking about what is essentially a kind of zero budgeting scenario. So you have a certain amount of money as an arts council. And if you give 10 million to cultural democracy initiatives, you have taken away 10 million.
Is that the understanding now in the UK?
Yeah. No, I mean, so I'm just wondering in the context that you articulated, were the funds for those initiatives seen to have taken resources away from the traditional
you're asking.
Yeah, because
okay,
in the
I thought that was happening in the UK now.
Oh,
no, it is.
Yeah,
it still is.
It is.
It's very much happening.
So we were trying to say,
I just wanted to make sure that that's what you were saying.
No, I mean,
and you're figuring out what's going on in some.
Exactly. I mean, very recently, we've had a significant reduction in funding for opera, for example, which has been very controversial because the money is going elsewhere.
Okay.
And I'm just wondering whether the context was the same.
Okay. First of all, I don't think we call it the artistic class when we mean all of the arts producers, consumers, and the people who work with art, how they press, the government. I don't think they work with the term cultural democracy, for example. The difference between democratization of culture and cultural democracy is totally academic and intellectual. Have you?
Yeah.
I've never seen any social movement taking the cabinet of the secretariat saying cultural democracy. No, that doesn't really, or there's no such understanding.
It has in the UK.
Yeah, there you go. So there's no such thing. No. And plus, the artistic movement or the arts movement or the artistic class, they are also a little pulverized. They're also very classified. The theater, the circus, the visual arts, and so on and so forth. There's not a very coherent movement. But in terms of budgeting, I didn't have time to bring that because I loved your presentation because of the numbers as well. It's so interesting that you just let us go through the table and go like, oh, really? Really interesting. I wish I could have done that. The budget, I would say, for cultural democracy-based cultural policies in São Paulo budget, for example, I would say it's hovering, it's like probably 10% only, 10, 15%. And only for the policies that reached that level of the law that continued. And we have a few. And for example, in the current secretariat, oh, there's a recording, there we go. So, okay. So the current secretariat is aiming more on cultural events, for example, which is basically putting events out there, like concerts and things like that. Or building new institution, for example, such as a new arts center, for example. So the cultural democracy policies are only continuing now because probably is at this level of state. So and plus, I was just telling my colleagues here that I would like to have some explanation why the arts movement is so, where is it after the pandemic? Really, at least the municipal level, I don't see them, I haven't seen them. I worked at the secretariat back before the pandemic and we had people invading, the cabinet of the secretariat, pushing for an agenda. And today we have like some really weird things going on in the cultural realm, and I don't see them any fight. We would say that maybe I would say a new study that the pandemic we didn't have as much as we had in the global north, some sort of financial help for the culture and creative sector. It took like almost 2 years in the pandemic to have some sort of help for artists during the pandemic. So I would say that kind of maybe triggered the class movement to really not have as much power as they had before. So this is not going on, unfortunately. There's no movement, at least the municipal level, I can see that. And not even so much at the national level. Would you say at the national level there's a lot of movement going on, culturally speaking, for cultural arts?
I think I would say that in the national level, we can see this social movement around these two laws, the Paulo Gustavo law and Aldir Blanc law, because they are laws that were built with between the cultural movement and the legislative in Brazil, because it was an interesting movement that we could see, because we had Bolsonaro's government in the executive, but the social movements were able to build and to demand these two emergency law in relationship with the Congress in Brazil, and in the relationship with the representatives in the Congress. And now these social movements, I think, they are around the implementation of these two laws in the country. Because, as I said, these two laws, they are in the relationship with the states and the municipalities in the country. So now we are seeing the financial transfer, the transfer for financial resources between the central government, the federal government, to the states and to the municipalities, to funding the cultural production in local levels. So I think the social movements, they are around now in Brazil in these two laws in the country.
Thank you so much, Juliana, and thank you. Oh, sorry, Santiago.
I want to say only one idea, because there is a risk if we reduce the discussion about inequality only in the public funding issues, because we need, for example, to improve the presence of women in the workforce. We need regulations, we need social care, security systems, no? There are a lot of
it's more
measures
than,
that we need to discuss, no? Exactly, that's
sure.
must.
I totally agree with you.
Lots of work still to do, but this has been completely fascinating, such different and yet relatable experiences. So thank you very much, panel, and please join me in thanking our panel and a lively audience. And I think we now have a break until 6 when we have the evening session, so we can continue conversations outside.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
your chair.